Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon for those of you who are in the UK or on another European time zone. My name's Duncan Edwards. I'm the CEO of British American Business, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this BAB discussion where we're going to be talking about the global rule of law and why this issue matters to international businesses. In the US and the UK, a reliable and consistent legal system is sometimes taken for granted, and it shouldn't be. And it certainly isn't the case everywhere around the world. And responsible companies and trade organizations like British American Business need to be advocating for high standards everywhere that they do business. So BAB is delighted to be hosting this discussion today. And many thanks to our member and sponsor of today's session, LexisNexis, through their Rule of Law Foundation. We have a really terrific group of panelists to talk through this issue today and to get the conversation going. And we hope those of you who are on the call will participate in the conversation in the normal way. And to get things started, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our moderator for today's conversation. Rachel Chambers is an assistant professor of business law at the University of Connecticut. So over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and what a pleasure it is to be here with you today talking about this subject. So before we get cracking, just a few house rules to start us off. So just in terms of what we will cover in the next hour, we're going to spend about 40 minutes having a moderated discussion with the panelists, led by myself, but in a sort of interactive format. And then we'll devote the rest of the time to a Q&A with those attending. Please feel very free to raise your hand, to unmute yourself, and to interact with our panelists. This is intended to be an informal format and one in which we can each, speak. We don't need to use the chat or the Q&A. Although, if you need to do so, please feel free to use that approach as well. The session is being recorded, you may have seen, and the recording will be available on request should you wish for it. Just one last request, if you can keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking, that's obviously helpful in terms of just making everything run smoothly. So with that, just to say a couple of words of introduction about our subject for today. So the American Bar Association describes the rule of law as a set of principles or ideals for ensuring an orderly and just society. So the rule of law assumes certain things: that no one is above the law, that everyone is treated equally under the law, that everyone is held accountable to the same laws, that there are clear and fair processes for enforcing laws, that there's an independent judiciary, and that human rights are guaranteed for all. But as we know, throughout the world, over the world, we see threats to the rule of law. Top of mind at the moment, in the times we're living in, the pandemic, special emergency legislation, which has restricted individual freedoms and rights in the interests of public health, has been enacted. So the subject for today is very timely: global rule of law, growing your business responsibly. And we're going to talk about business benefits from operating under a system where there's the rule of law, and what business can do to enhance the rule of law. And in thinking about how to grow your business responsibly, we'll use the lens of ESG to consider relationships with suppliers in countries that do not have an established rule of law, and about navigating the growing landscape of legal and non-legal drivers to improve ESG performance. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists today, starting with Ian McDiddle from LexisNexis. So over to you, Ian, just to introduce yourself.
Oh, hello, everyone. Don't have much more to say than that. I am the General Counsel for LexisNexis. I also have the privilege of being the president of the LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation. As you can hear from my accent, I'm from the UK and am a barrister by training and inclination, which I always like to say to people means that I spent the first 6 years of my career wearing a blonde wig and a black dress. That's me.
Thank you, Ian. And next up, Ruston Rao from BT.
Hi, everybody. I also started life as a barrister Ian, but I'm going to steal that description for the next time I do one of these. So hi everyone, I'm Ruston Rao. I'm a legal director at BT, so British Telecom, which is a multinational telecommunications company headquartered out of London, but we do business in around 180 countries and have presence in 60 countries around the world. My current role is I look after, for our global division, all the UK lawyers and regulatory folk in the Americas too. So I have North and South America. I've been at BT 11 years in a variety of roles, both inside the business and as a lawyer. And I'm delighted to come along today and join in this discussion.
Thank you, Ruston. And David Rivkin of Debevoise.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm a partner at Debevoise and Plimpton in our New York and London offices, although these days, of course, it's just New York. I'm looking forward to returning to London. I'm a proud member of the board of British American Business. At Debevoise, I am co-chair of our Business Integrity and ESG group. I'm a former co-chair of our International Disputes group, and also relevant to this conversation, I'm a former president of the International Bar Association.
Brilliant. Well, thank you each for introducing yourselves, and we'll kick off the discussion. So my first question, which is actually directed to you, Ian, to set us up for this subject for today, what is the rule of law and why is it important?
Well, you gave during your introduction a definition of the rule of law, which is from the American Bar Association. The important thing is, first of all, I think, to always define the rule of law, to talk about what we mean. You hear it all the time at the moment in politics, and politicians throw it around without any real concept of what they mean. So first of all, it's important to talk about what we mean by the rule of law, which is what I'm going to do in a minute. The second is how we came to the definition of the rule of law. And I want to talk about that first, because very often the rule of law has been created by a group of people sitting in a room and deciding what the rule of law means and just agreeing. Very often in organizations like the United Nations, where they take 25 pages to tell you what the rule of law means, and it's closely typed compromise text that is practically impenetrable. And so what we wanted to do was to look through the history of the subject. Around the world, all kinds of successful societies, no matter what their society background is, no matter what their politics, religion, no matter what the social circumstances are, there are certain elements which are key themes which go through all of those different areas. And so by taking the key themes from all the different parts of the world, we wanted to show it's a genuinely global concept. It doesn't belong to one part of the world, the idea of the rule of law. In all well-functioning societies, you have these basic concepts. And we wanted to take the politics out of it as well, so that we can get this as accepted as possible across any country. So what we found in history were 4 recurring themes, which we believe form the core of the rule of law. That is equality under the law. In other words, you have to be treated the same no matter who you are. The second is an independent judiciary, which is what you've mentioned. I heard you mention the idea of a clear and fair process. For me, that's implied in the functioning of an independent judiciary. And so I don't call that out as a separate thing. But if you have a properly functioning independent judiciary, they should be applying fair processes to what you're doing. The third point is that you should have laws which are published and accessible. There should be no hidden laws. That implies the rule against retrospective liability and things like that, because clearly you have to know about the law at the time you're breaking it. And the final thing is an access to remedy. You have to have the ability to get reasonable access to reasonable remedy. You notice I don't use the word justice, access to justice. That's a very, very complicated subject. What I'm talking about here is the ability to resolve a grievance with an independent judiciary in accordance with the law whilst being treated equally. And so for us, that's the basis of the rule of law. And why is it important? Because every other concept in law or society relies upon these concepts to work. People talk about human rights, for example, and they're absolutely right to talk about human rights, but you can't enforce a human right without the functioning of the 4 principles of the rule of law that I've spoken about. Contracts, for example, as we're talking to a business community here, contracts are pointless in an environment where you don't have the rule of law, the ability to get remedy and the ability to have that remedy adjudicated on fairly. Land disputes, whatever they may be, personal injury claims, whatever you are talking about, without the fundamentals of the rule of law that I've just described, these other things don't work. So it's a fundamental building block of any successful society. When you have those 4 bits in place, then as far as we're concerned, it's up to that society to decide how they want to develop and build on these things. But you can't have a successful and prosperous society without those 4 elements. That's effectively what it means and why it's so important.
And that actually brings me to my second question, Ian, which was, how can you share more on how the rule of law is important or critical even for business, building on what you just said? How does it impact economic growth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very lucky that some colleagues, very clever colleagues of mine at Lexis, did some analysis, statistical analysis. And what we were able to do was correlate the rule of law with various socioeconomic measures. The first one, and one which obviously most directly impacts business, is per capita GDP. There's a very, very close statistical correlation between the strength of the rule of law and per capita GDP. There also happens to be a correlation between the rule of law and other socioeconomic measures like life expectancy, like homicide rates, like corruption rates, all of these kind of things. Now, hopefully what you can see from what I'm building up a picture here is that it's absolutely crucial to the business community to have a strong rule of law. Per capita GDP, for example, is obvious. That's the stimulation of economic activity happening. But also, as I said, the other socioeconomic measures which give you a grounding across a whole range of things that provide a stable business environment. One of the success stories of many countries is that those countries where there is the strong rule of law attract huge overseas investment because people have a fair expectation that their investment is going to be protected. If you can't protect your investment, companies try to avoid investing in places like that. And so that's the close correlation, and why what we say and what I say now is that this isn't just a good thing to do, supporting the rule of law. This business community, I'm talking to you all, this is in your self-interest to do. You benefit by stronger rule of law across a whole range of measures. So, as I say, I'd leave you with the point that not only is it the right thing to do, but it's good for your pocket too. And that's why I think it's important to this community.
And I think we'll come back to that question of what business can actually do to enhance the rule of law, to your point, to those who are on the call and thinking about, heeding what you say. But just to turn to you, David, what's the current landscape in terms of institutions that help promote the rule of law? What are the challenges we're seeing around business and the rule of law at this current time?
Sure. Thank you, Rachel. And as you point out, and as Duncan pointed out earlier, there are many challenges to the rule of law these days, given the economic environment, given the distressing developments, certainly in the United States. As Duncan said, we can't be assured of the rule of law in any country, including here. But fortunately, there are many organizations and institutions that are working to promote and protect the rule of law. And I can just mention a few. One, I mentioned the International Bar Association, of which I used to be president, and the IBA has many active projects, for example, to protect the independence of the judiciary, to protect against corruption in the judiciary, which undermines the rule of law and otherwise, to protect business and human rights, climate change and human rights, and other such projects. I think Ian mentioned the foundation that LexisNexis runs, which is an outstanding example of what an individual company can do to promote the rule of law through its resources. I should say that Chubb also has a very active foundation that supports projects to develop the rule of law. There are the ABA ROLI, the Rule of Law Institute, is active in projects around the world. The World Economic Forum is focusing more and more on the rule of law because of the important relationship between the rule of law and economic development, as Ian was just pointed out. The UN, of course, has many different subparts that are focused on promoting the rule of law in developing countries and otherwise, and work to provide funding and otherwise to support judiciaries and the other essential elements. Those are just a few. I also think that organizations like British American Business are critical to promoting the rule of law throughout the world, and local chambers of commerce. So that's just really a small summary, but there are many ways for those who want to protect the rule of law to become involved in it, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're in business, whether you're in academia or otherwise.
Thanks. Yes, I agree. And I would say in some ways, these initiatives are on the increase. You know, for example, we see under the SDGs, peace, justice, and strong institutions work being done. You know, you mentioned the UN Global Compact and companies that are part of that. So we do, I think, you know, there's a march forward, but inevitably that's always tempered by the challenges that the kind of global environment currently presents. Just turning to that, and again with you, if you don't mind, David. So in developing countries where there's a lack of institutionalized rule of law, what are the current sort of international dispute settlement bodies? You know, what can business turn to in circumstances where the rule of law is not being applied?
Sure. Well, it is very important for businesses doing business and operating around the world to pay very close attention to the network of investment treaties, bilateral investment treaties, and multilateral investment treaties, which can provide very substantial and important protections that go beyond the national law in whatever host country is the focus of the investment. There are literally thousands of bilateral investment treaties between countries. They are designed to promote investment for the reasons that Ian was mentioning earlier. They provide various rights to foreign investors in order to promote investment. And in order to make those, those rights include, for example, fair and equitable treatment. They include no expropriation without just compensation. They include treatment no worse than domestic companies, and no discrimination involved against foreign companies. Those are very important protections when you are engaged in operations and investments in countries where there is some challenge to the rule of law, where you may not feel comfortable about an independent or fair judiciary, for example. You certainly don't want to be caught in the courts of that local country if the host country takes actions that have a severe impact. And the great thing about investing where a bilateral investment treaty is applicable is that you automatically gain these protections. You don't need contract, you don't need a specific assurance by the host country. And in order to make these promised protections meaningful, bilateral investment treaties also provide for independent arbitration, often in front of a body that is run by the World Bank called the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID, but also under some UN rules called the UNCITRAL rules, or often under other arbitration institutions, such as the ICC or the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce or others. And the arbitration mechanisms provide for a fair and independent tribunal. Usually each side appoints one, and the third is appointed either jointly or by an institution like ICSID. And it provides for a readily enforceable award anywhere around the world. And the record is that most states comply voluntarily with any award against them. Our firm last year won a $6 billion award against Pakistan for a mining company who had invested billions in developing a mine only to find the license taken away at the last minute. And we've seen others. Of course, host states also win these arbitrations. It's a very fair process. But it's something that anyone investing in a country where there is any challenge to the rule of law, or frankly, even if you feel that there isn't such a challenge, you should look to make sure that you are investing through a country that has an investment treaty with that country. So if that means you use, if for example, there is no UK or US treaty with that particular host country, but there is a Dutch treaty, you can invest through a Dutch subsidiary and gain the protections of that treaty. So companies ought to engage, they must engage in the same kind of planning around investment treaties that they routinely do for tax or other purposes in terms of how they structure those investments, because these can be very important protections when the rule of law goes awry.
Thanks, David. Just to mention and if there's a great conversation going in the chat and some links been put up. So thank you so much for that, Duncan and Ian. And just turning again to you, Ian, for a question, back to this point about what business actually can do to enhance rule of law in local contexts.
Yeah, sure. The starting point, I think, if I can sort of give a big picture, because obviously lots of businesses are different. So if I can sort of give a philosophy that might help businesses, the way that we at Lexis have approached the rule of law, and which we advocate others should do so, is what we call deploying your core skills. And what that means is basically take something that you are already good at in some way, and it doesn't need to be your kind of main thing. It could, there are a range of skills across any business, but the idea is to take your core skills and find a project where you can deploy them. This is, we think, is the most effective way, and a sort of direct action sort of form of supporting the rule of law. And so I was once asked, just to illustrate the point, someone stood up in an audience and said, "Oh yeah, but what about if you're a tobacco manufacturer? You can't sort of take tobacco and distribute it for the rule of law, can you?" And so I said, well, no, but that misunderstands the strengths argument. So what would a tobacco company be good at? They're very good at government lobbying. That's why they still can sell tobacco usually. And so you can take what skills you have in the organization, in this case, government lobbying, and use all of your interactions with the government people that you are speaking to talk to them about the importance of the rule of law. There's another example on the other extreme, where a great example of a motorbike company, where a motorbike company, and again, I hope you're thinking, goodness, how could a motorbike company contribute to the rule of law? Well, what they did was they found a project where some pro bono lawyers wanted to deliver pro bono legal advice to very remote areas. And so they donated their motorbikes, some motorbikes specifically to allow lawyers to get to very difficult to reach areas. And so what I'm trying to say by those examples is, if you think about what your organization is good at, what its strengths are, and then with a bit of imagination, think about how you can deploy it to advance in, we believe, one of the 4 areas of the rule of law, which I've just outlined at the beginning. There's an opportunity for every company to make a contribution to this going forward.
Rachel, if you don't mind, do you mind if I just add,
I was going to ask you, yeah, so please do jump in.
Because I was just thinking about this question, and I completely agree with what Ian said. But I was just thinking, like, maybe on a more basic level, what companies can do to kind of enhance or enforce the rule of law. For me, it's really simple things. It's like, don't agree to deliver something or do something that you can't, right? Comply with the obligations in your contract. Use dispute resolution stuff. Don't do anything that's going to kind of interfere with the administration of justice. Help the government, help regulatory bodies, help institutions understand your business and the rule of law. and do things publicly. I'm not going to use this session to just wax lyrical about how great BT is, but as a company, I'm very proud to work there because of the things they do in the public domain to endorse the rule of law. But there are some really simple things you can do, right? If you have an ethical standpoint around, I'm going to do business this way, and I'm not going to agree with this, and I'm going to stick by all my obligations, in effect, that is supporting the rule of law and being respectful for it. And I think it's important that companies have that standpoint.
Can I just add to, sorry, to that point and say that the way that it might be helpful or not to think about this is that there are two types of corporate social responsibility. There is what I would call internal corporate social responsibility and external corporate social responsibility. The examples that Ruston just gave are, to me, examples of what I would call internal corporate social responsibility. In other words, the way you conduct yourself about your daily business and doing the right thing. The example I gave, for example, the motorbike company, is what I would call external corporate social responsibility, which is a contribution outside of what you just doing your business. So there are ways to contribute in both areas. The other thing I would say as well is that for those people who are watching who live in particularly difficult environments where sometimes it is easy for us to say these things, and they're in very difficult environments and it's very difficult for them to actually do these kind of things, I have a clear piece of advice, and it is to try to operate through associations or other bodies where you can work collectively instead of taking the risk of putting your own head above the parapet when, frankly, in some areas it might get shot off. And so trying to form or join organizations who can form a body of action or opinion may be the way to do it in the more difficult environments around the world.
That's a very good point, Ian, and also to amplify your voice rather than just being one voice among many.
Rachel, can I follow up on that? Actually, I just put into the chat the website of an organization called the Corporate Alliance for the Rule of Law, or CAROL for short, which has members like Walmart, Microsoft, Chevron, Novartis. Our firm is happily a member and helped form this, but it's an excellent way. The idea is by pooling the resources to invest in projects around to promote the rule of law. It's a way that companies can help promote the rule of law, again, without necessarily being, the flag waver. It's an excellent organization that is really just getting started in some ways, but has already accomplished some good work. So for members out there, it's something to consider.
Thank you. So actually, and just coming back to what Ian sort of has brought us onto what a second group of questions I have, which sort of bring us into more ESG related issues. And I wanted to turn to you, Ruston, for the first question. So I wanted to ask you how contracts can be used to support companies' ethical or CSR or ESG policies, as well as to protect the company from a material issue that could damage the reputation or the business itself.
Sure. So look, I think there's definitely things companies can do, or any organization can do for that matter, using their contracts to kind of support their ethical or ESG policies. I think protect might be a little bit harder, but in terms of support, look, I think a lot of companies talk the talk, and one of the ways you can maybe give some credibility to walking the walk is using your contracts. So if you are very clear about some of the policies or some of the positions that are important to you, and you put them in your contracts, and you basically say to your suppliers, for example, these things are really important to me, and you are going to comply with them if you're going to be a supplier to me. That is one way that gives it maybe a bit more teeth, right? So it's not just a public forum. We are saying as an organization, this is how we do business. I also think, Rachel, it can be used to give some credibility internally as well. Because I think you need to win the hearts and minds and convince your people as well as your suppliers, customers, and the public. So one that I definitely think gives you a bit of credibility and teeth. I think the other thing is around supply chains. So again, thinking about BT, we have a number of policies and positions that we insist that our suppliers sign up to. And that stuff, it's a raft of different things: sourcing with human dignity, environmental management, carbon emissions, human rights. We have a bunch of things, and you can definitely use your contracts to again kind of give yourself credibility and ensure that your supply chain complies with the things that are important to you. And that's something that we do very effectively, and I think lots of companies do and more do. I guess the last thing, which is slightly different, but where contracts can probably help, is around data and around capturing data. So it's not, a lot of companies are using questionnaires, and I know a lot of suppliers are feeling it's very much by death by questionnaires nowadays. But if you think about, more and more companies are making disclosures, and they need to measure and track some of the commitments they make. And you can definitely use your contracts, I think, to ensure that your suppliers, for example, provide you the information you need for those disclosures, right? It goes back to credibility with your internal people, but also the external market. So there's probably other ways, Rachel, but contracts can definitely help to support your policies. Protect is a little bit harder, I think, and I'm thinking maybe here possibly too grand. But if I think about some of the big kind of, ethical or ESG disasters, if that's not too strong a word, look, there's no doubt you can put things in your contracts to limit liability. You can put disclaimers on disclosures, but fundamentally, I think if something goes south, and it really goes south, I don't think any spokesperson is going to say, but we had a clause in our contract that said that wasn't allowed. It doesn't mean that contracts can't help. I mean, things like audit rights are really important, but I think having good governance and prevention and detection is going to be more helpful. So contracts have a role to play there, but I'm not quite sure it's going to give you an impregnable shield.
No, I agree. You can set the tone, can't you? And you can set your expectations, but you need to have other planks to your plan in place. David, did you want to say something on this?
I think Ruston has made the key points, and there's no doubt the contracts can be used to both support the protection and the positions, but also to protect. Ruston pointed out that in terms of legal liability, it could provide some protection. I agree. In terms of reputational risk, it's different. But even in terms of reputational risk, if you're able to say to the NGOs and others who may be concerned about a supply chain issue, forced labor, or a business and human rights issue, that look, we've put these protections in place, we've done what we can, it can make a substantial difference. And it's surprising to us how few companies use contracts to protect themselves in this way. Every contract has a standard anti-corruption clause. But very few of them have clauses protecting against the kinds of issues that Ruston mentioned, and I'm delighted that BT does. And it's something we've been working with our clients on to try to sensitize them to that they can and should put the same kinds of clauses in that they're used to doing for anti-corruption clauses.
Yes, interesting. And I think, this is gaining traction. For example, the American Bar Association has worked on model contract clauses, looking at the issues that Ruston raises. And so I think, it's a growing field and certainly one to keep an eye on.
I was just going to say as well that if you think about it, any resistance to the inclusion of such a clause in your negotiation should be sounding alarm bells to you. As a third party that you're going to deal with. No, I don't want to include in the contract that I will not bribe people, right? That should be a worry.
Agreed. Turning to you, David, the difference between hard and soft law, just to sort of set us up for this discussion of CSR and ESG. How do you see that changing with respect to business, the hard and soft law piece?
Yeah, I think we're basically at a point now where there isn't much of a difference between hard law and soft law for a number of reasons. One is that some of the key soft law principles, like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, have become so ingrained that courts have begun to effectively say that not following it can be a violation of a local tort or duty of care or other issue. I'm not sure that that's right as a legal matter, but it's certainly a trend we're seeing. You see that in the Milli Defensi decision against Shell, where the courts ordered Shell to reduce their carbon footprint by a fixed percentage, and used the UNGPs as an example of the duty of care. So you see that, and in any event, if you violate a core soft law principle, call it, in terms of protecting business human rights or other issues, the reputational and financial risk can be equal to or greater than violating a hard law. But the other reason why there is much less of a difference these days is that we see many of these principles turning into hard law. We see the EU due diligence regulation, which is going to impact not just companies that operate out of the EU, but any foreign company that operates in the EU globally, to be able have to undertake certain obligations with respect to due diligence on business and human rights. You see on the climate change area, what used to be voluntary standards for reporting and disclosure becoming hard law, again, in the EU, with the transparency principles that they've published, and in the UK, or you see the SEC working on such principles now. So there really is no difference, and companies and their internal lawyers and others must view soft law as just as important in working to protect as hard law.
Agreed. Yes, that development in terms of human rights due diligence laws, starting in France, Germany, now the EU, Norway, is certainly a trend that has really taken off in this last year or so, and that does change the landscape somewhat in terms of the soft law, hard law. Back to you, Ruston, if I may. I wanted to ask, how do companies such as BT ensure that their supply chains don't contain a bad apple that could cause them the harm and damage we've talked about, the losses potentially?
Yeah, it's look, it's really, really difficult, and the reality is that you can't ensure that there isn't going to be a bad apple in your supply chain, and depending on what kind of business you are and where you operate and what you sell, supply chains are complicated things, and some of them are clear and some of them are a little bit opaque, so it's difficult. So I think you have to just be realistic that you can't protect yourself or give yourself a guarantee. So it comes back to what you can do. And, first and foremost, top of my list is do your homework, right? You've got to do your homework. And there are so many tools and organizations out there now, and more and more, that can help you do that, to help you do your due diligence on your suppliers, who they are, who owns them, where they do business, who their subsidiaries are. Have they got anything in their skeleton closet that should worry you? You've got to have clear frameworks. You've got to have clear policies. You've got to set up compliance teams, invest money, invest time, and invest resources. Carry out audits. Invite audits on yourself. To see whether you've got the right policies and the right frameworks in place. So I think it's a combination of a lot of things. To give yourself as much confidence as you can that you are doing business with the people that you think you're doing business with, and they would also then comply with the things that you thrust upon them. So it's hard, Rachel, and I can't see it get any easier. But there are good models out there, and there are certainly things you can do to bring down that risk.
Yeah, that's a very interesting points you raise, and I think it also makes me think about how do we ensure that this comes out that isn't just you in law and the general counsel's office or equivalent, but how do you roll this out throughout the company, and how do we to make sure that everyone within the company understands this. So but let me turn to another question, actually for you also, Ruston, when we're thinking about CSR, for companies doing business in many countries, navigating different cultures, business practices and laws, what are the policies that companies can put in place to ensure that they, first of all, follow these different laws and policies, but also aren't put at a competitive disadvantage in these local contexts?
Yeah, another very tricky one. Thanks, Rachel. So look, I actually had a chat very recently with our Director of Compliance and Ethics about this point. You know, thinking about all the different countries that we do business in, and how on earth can you make sure that they're all stuck to? And her answer was really clear. Actually, you can't. If you are going to have an organization that does business around the world, and if you start to try to tailor your policies on anti-corruption and bribery, on carbon emissions and sourcing with human dignity, I think you're going to end up in a bit of a pickle, and you're going to tie yourself up in knots. Now, there aren't certain things that you can do culturally. For example, if you're rolling out a training program, there are certain things that you might want to do to tailor to different environments. But fundamentally, I think for certain policies, I think you have to be consistent. And what the director also said to me is that prosecutors aren't interested in the fact, oh, I have a policy here, but a slightly different policy here and a slightly different policy here. They expect you to have one policy that you apply globally. When it comes to commercial disadvantage, Rachel, the reality is you might be. It's possible that you might be. You know, some business practices in some countries in the world, you know, won't fit with your policies and your position as a company. And I think you just have to suck it up, because there are some things that you have to put above commercial gain if you are really serious about them. And I know that's fighting talk, you know, when you're not under considerable pressure to meet targets and meet investor, some investor pressures on numbers. But fundamentally, I think you just have to accept that. So what do? I think you have the consistency, you have the clarity, and then it's very similar to what I was saying about supply chains. You know, you have a good program, you have top-down messaging, you have things like speak up hotlines, you have mandatory training, you put resources in countries where you think there might be a bit of a risk. You have 3 lines of defense structures. You can look out for outliers in data. You can make sure you're paying a fair salary, right? You know, there are some places in the world where salaries are very low, things are very hard. If you want to make sure that your policies are being followed, then don't make life difficult for some of your employees. So it is hard. It's really hard to navigate the different cultures. But I think if you start trying to tailor your policies on certain things to some of those cultures, you'll probably find yourself on a sticky wicket. And I guess culture, you know, it runs deep, right? It can take time, but I think you need to stick to your guns and just accept the fact that sometimes you might lose out, but it's more important to lose out.
Yes, and I think, sorry, go on, Ian.
Sorry, I was just going to say that Ruston mentioned a point sort of in passing that I was going to emphasize. And I think that old chestnut tone from the top is absolutely crucial. It is very difficult for someone on the front line, whatever that front line is, to kind of make these unilateral decisions without it being embedded in the culture of the organization. It's much more difficult. And so the first thing I would recommend that anyone does is, first of all, get your senior leadership behind the concept, because then when your company's senior leadership is behind the concept, all of those other things that Ruston mentioned, I think, become a little easier. And again, if you think that you are going to be in some environments put to a disadvantage, I think you also should try to work through associations and get collective agreements, get collective action. These are the things that they also will help to change the whole environment and not just your business side of things as well, as a suggestion.
Yeah, and I was going to say, to your point about investors and the short-term sort of quarterly results, obviously the hope is that with the rise of ESG that there will be acknowledgement and understanding of the longer term emphasis of some of these programs and activities. David, did you want to say something?
Yes, just a brief but important caveat to what Ruston and Ian each said. I completely agree with that, and tone from the top and having effective corporate-wide policies are so important. But one of the things that we've seen in representing our clients now is that Plaintiffs' lawyers, if a problem arises in a foreign jurisdiction, plaintiffs' lawyers are seeking to use the corporate policies coming from the parent company or public statements by the CEO espousing those policies as evidence that the company itself supposedly is no longer regarding corporate separateness, and therefore using these policies as a way to pierce the corporate veil and bring a claim against the parent company and not the local operating subsidiary. And I would refer people to the Vedanta and the Shell cases in the UK Supreme Court in the last year or so, which are prime examples of this trend. You see some of that happening in the US as well. So in drafting the policies to affect exactly what Ruston and Ian are saying, it's important to draft them in such a way that leaves some leeway for the operating subsidiaries to follow those policies in a way that makes sense for them. In a way, you can just add some language that makes clear that while this is a corporate-wide policy, the individual companies have some must be the ones to actually conduct them to protect yourself against that argument, which we're seeing more and more.
Duncan, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. What a fascinating conversation this has been. So I tried to make a point in the chat, and I just wanted to expand on that. So the very clear principles that Ian described about the rule of law, you know, I wonder sometimes if that gets confused with actually that laws around the world are actually different, and there's no reason. You know, that's a matter of kind of local democracy or local cultural tradition and so on. And it seems to me that sometimes people get confused between the two, and there's a sort of risk of kind of Western imperialism in terms of what is seen as kind of good law and the right way to behave. And in a increasingly kind of multipolar world, you know, is there some risk in that? And I mean, it's a kind of very high level question. And I think, you know, I was intrigued by what Ruston said about, you know, having to, you know, companies have to make decisions, and sometimes it means that you won't be able to do business in some markets. And I've certainly experienced that in my old life as well. So I'm just curious about this risk of kind of, well, Western law is the right way, you know, we know best. And you see that with kind of a little bit of extraterritoriality from the EU with GDPR, and with, you know, the UK and the US with the FCPA and UK Bribery Act and other things like that. Anyway, I'm just curious what the panel thinks about that kind of rambling question.
Who'd like to answer that? And just for everyone else on the call, just to let you know that we're going to open it up to questions from others. So please prepare the questions, raise your hand, and we'll obviously let you speak. But go ahead, who would like to answer?
I
Duncan?
can just mention a couple of things, I think. The first is that you hit on some very important points, and it's one reason why we don't comment on a specific law, save insofar as it goes against the 4 principles of the rule of law that I've outlined. Anything beyond that is usually a consideration for that environment, that country, that system, etc. And I think that's important because, as I said right at the start, we want to try to take the politics out of the rule of law. Yeah, if we can get these basics implemented around the world, well, how a country kind of develops its politics is a matter for them. But the basics of the rule of law, I think, are the important starting points for me.
Thanks, Ian. Does anyone else want to speak to this point? And are there any questions other than Duncan's? Just turning to you, Nicolina. Any questions from the audience? I can't see everyone, so I just wanted to make sure perhaps if anyone raises their hand, you can let me know in the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to ask one more myself, if I may. So in a market where the speed of decision making and execution can obviously be a competitive advantage, how do companies strike a balance between having enough information? I think this is really one for you again, Ruston, to feel comfortable and not taking material risk that will hold up their business. So, taking these different considerations into account.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, it's one, and I'm sure everyone on this call would agree. Things are only getting faster, right? Things aren't slowing down. And I think a lot of people feel during the pandemic, things got even faster to a level they didn't think it would get to. So it's really difficult. And there's no doubt, especially in the market that we're in, that speed wins, not universally, but customers are more and more demanding, and you need to move on things very quickly. Again, it's not a very exciting answer, I'm afraid, Rachel, but it just comes back to doing your homework. I think you have to put yourself in a position where you feel you can make an informed call, and that's fundamentally what it comes down to, right? We are trying to put ourselves in a position where we can make an informed decision, and some decisions are riskier than others, but there is probably a threshold where you feel, okay, I've got enough, and I can make a call here. And in some circumstances, you have less and less time, and it can be very, very difficult. But you have to have the courage of your convictions. I was thinking of a recent example in our own business where we were under pressure to do a deal. Customers very insistent on using a certain supplier. We didn't know this supplier. We started doing some preliminary checks, and the customers putting more and more pressure on us to do the deal. And I actually stopped it, because I felt it was too much of an unknown here. And going back to what I said before about P&Ls and targets, you do come under pressure, but the reality is you've got to be comfortable. I think you have to be comfortable and feel that if the CEO calls you up and says, "What on earth are you doing?" you have a valid and justifiable reason for making the decision you made. So do your homework. If you need to find a way to speed up your processes in terms of doing your homework, then look at that. Make sure you can make an informed decision. And again, Rachel, it's difficult, but you need to make a call based on your own comfort level, your own risk assessment. I say that there's one thing to add, and I'm conscious of time. What's really important for me in to have that culture, to make that culture a success, is that your seniors back you. So you make a call on something that might be unpopular, and you say, "Look, I'm just not comfortable. We don't know enough about X, Y, Z. They're operating in an area that I'm really nervous around," and that your seniors will back you and say, "You're absolutely right," because that is how you get a culture where people feel comfortable saying no to things for the right reasons and don't feel pressured into doing something because they think they're going to get told off.
That's very helpful. And yes, conscious of time, I have one last question, but I also want to give each of the panelists a chance, either to comment on what each other has said, or more broadly coming back to the subject for today, growing business responsibly. So thinking about the increasing list of legal regulations, which we've touched on, but more broadly, and the question of the rule of law and how, perhaps your sort of top line takeaways for the subject matter for today. So why don't I start with you, Ian, and then come to David, and then Ruston last.
Well, I just add one more item of self-interest that everybody can think about when we talk about this kind of a subject. Over the course of the last years that I've been the general counsel, the change that I've seen in recruitment has been incredible. When I started to recruit someone years ago, the questions at the end of the interview, I could tell you what they were going to be. Is there a pension scheme? How many days holiday do I get? And is there a bonus that comes with this, right? They were usually the questions. The question I get now at the end of the interview is, how do I get involved in this rule of law stuff that you guys do? Yeah. And the thing is that what we are finding, and I'm sure what many companies are finding, is that many more people are making a decision as to which employer to go to on the basis of some kind of ethical input as well. We know, for example, we have a huge technology group, and we know that people have decided to come to work for us instead of some other large nameless technology companies because they saw the rule of law stuff And they thought that's really the kind of thing we want to be involved with. There's some kind of greater ethical input to the world that they have. And this is increasingly what we're finding with people who want to, make their career choices. And so I would say, to pass on to your companies, that being involved in these kind of activities and having this as a stance, having this as a motivating feature for your company, can also help with recruiting the best talent.
Thank you, Ian. David.
I fully agree with what Ian just said. It's certainly important to us in recruiting lawyers out of law school that we are engaged in so many rule of law and human rights activities. But I would just reinforce the theme that you've heard throughout, that it is important for corporate culture to support the rule of law, both externally and internally, and to be entirely consistent in the way you do so, to work, whether it's individually with the host governments where you're operating around the world, or through organizations like the ones that we mentioned, including BAB. It is so important to to protect your own investments by ensuring the rule of law wherever you're investing. At the same time, it is very important that throughout your company, there is a recognition and respect for the rule of law, for ESG policies, and that it's done in a consistent way. You can't have the corporate social responsibility arm of the company making great promises about what you do if, in fact, those promises are not going to be followed at every level of the company and supply chain. And we've seen companies get into trouble when their disclosure is not as carefully drafted in this realm as it is in other realms. It's important to, again, as I pointed out, to draft important corporate policies and to do it in a way that creates the protection that you want and implements the policies you want without causing other problems. So it is truly an area where it's developing quickly, where you have to pay attention to the soft law, to the hard law, and to do it in a careful and integrated way.
Thank you, David. And last to you, Ruston.
Look, I echo a lot of what Ian and David has said. I guess a few things in my head. One is I encourage everyone to get involved. Lots of companies today have lots of great programs, whether they're ESG related or the rule of law. I sometimes think not enough people get involved. So please get involved and be part of whatever your company is trying to do in this space. And the second and third things, maybe departing a little bit from the rule of law, is just around ESG and whatever your companies are doing or not doing. I'd say prevention is better than cure. Yes, you can use contracts to do things, and of course I take exactly what David said very seriously, but prevention is better than cure. And if you're worried about something, trust your instincts and don't be afraid to pipe up. Okay, really, you have a voice in these big corporations, so you should trust yourself and back yourself, and focus much more on what you can do to prevent and detect than to cure.
Wise words, thank you. And with that, I wanted to turn to Duncan just in the last minute or so to close us out for today and to thank our speakers.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Rachel, for moderating the conversation so brilliantly. And it has been a truly fascinating discussion. So thank you very much for giving us some of your time today, but also to our terrific speakers, to Ian, Ruston and David. Thank you so much for your contributions. I mean, it's clearly a fascinating conversation, and I'm still sort of grappling in my mind with the distinction between the principles of the rule of law and then the kind of execution of what are your standards and of behavior that you expect in an individual company, and what your tolerances are for differences in behavior as you do business globally. It's clear to me, certainly when you think about ESG, particularly the S, there are not consistent standards that companies adopt globally. It may be increasingly so on environmental and governance issues, but not on societal impact and so on. So lots of interesting topics to be addressed in the future on that subject. And we're going to be talking with our friends at Debevoise and others on, I think, next week, where we're going to be looking at the sometimes interesting relationship between doing business globally and the complex issue of human rights. So if you're interested in that, please join us next week. In the meantime, thanks again to our panelists. Thanks again to Rachel and to LexisNexis for supporting this event, and to all of you for attending. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.